Brian, thank you for coming back onto the show again.
It is my pleasure. Anytime.
I can't think of a better person to have had as a guest in the midst of this, to be honest.
We're rolling with it. We are
I'm,
rolling with
we are rolling with it. We're just going to roll with it. And in keeping with the American theme of Thanksgiving that's just come and gone, we'll be thankful in the midst of what has been a trying technical process. I don't know what we'll do to figure it all out, but I'll figure it out for the new year. I'll have a few weeks to figure it out. Brian, thanks for coming onto the show. And thank you to everyone who's watching and has been so patient with this over the last week or so. But we're going to dive into today's topic, and so that we don't miss out again. I named today's show as Sing with More Zing, and the reason I wanted to talk to you specifically about this was because you have so much expertise in this area. Let's just refresh for people who you are and your incredible level of expertise and experience. You're a professor at Indiana State, is that correct?
Indiana University, the Jacobs School of Music.
Okay, thank you. And what is your specific role at the university?
I am now a tenured full professor of voice, which was a relief and lovely position to get to. And it is it's an opera program.
Okay.
But there are other areas at the university that delve into music theater and early music, and so I am also a professor of voice pedagogy.
Okay.
And so we also offer a degree, a graduate certificate in vocology, which is an interdisciplinary look at voice, and then we also offer a doctoral minor in vocalogy.
Yeah. Okay.
Those are from my roots back in the National Center of Voice and Speech, run by Dr. Ingo Tietze. And so we've maintained that concept. I had it at NYU for the 12 years I was there, and then developed it here at IU.
Mm-hmm. So, just for people who are not familiar with the term vocology, do you want to just unwrap that a little bit for us?
It's the union of science and practice. So taking what we've learned from research and then figuring out how to practically apply that so that what you're doing in the studio makes sense.
Yeah.
That you can back it up. It's in a sense it's a step towards evidence-based teaching. Although if you look at evidence-based medicine, it's unbelievably rigorous to get to evidence-based.
Yeah.
So, but again, there's a movement in vocology to start including evidence-based things, and I definitely am in that line of thought as well. I think we should have some underlying principles that help get us to understanding what exercises we're employing in the studio, and what kind of musculature or acoustic response we're trying to get from the voice.
Yeah, right. And I guess one of the challenges around teaching singing for so many, for actually eons, is what I would refer to as some of the smoke and mirrors that have often been used around the teaching of voice. And I think the kind of work that ones like yourself are doing is really wonderful for students of voice, because it's removing the mystery, and giving people a far more codified pathway to understanding what they're doing. Is that a big part of what drives your research?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I like what you said. I've often said in talks I've given, but then also on my website and all, that it's really moving towards the demystification of voice.
Yeah.
Voice, because it's invisible, a lot of the instrument, it's inside the body, it's a guesswork, and it's guesswork based on hearing. But if you're a student that has not been exposed to a true master teacher, will use that term, and you've had a voice teacher, but maybe they didn't know the ins and outs, and also you haven't had experience in high level venues, listening to the best singers in the world.
Yep.
You may not have sound files that guide your work.
Yeah.
As well as someone who has been in high level venues and with high level singers and with a master teacher. So there has to be something else we go by. So I'm finding it interesting, really trying to unite those worlds, and even taking the smoke and mirrors and thinking, well, what's behind it? Right? It came about for a reason.
Yes.
So what do we need? Instead of dismissing it completely, which I do think that we need to move beyond that, as you're saying. But instead of dismissing it, see what is at the root at. What is someone trying to get at if they say sing from the diaphragm? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What are they trying to get at? And
Yes.
that way we can unite people who are avid, just voice lovers in general.
Yes. Yeah. Because terminology is such a such a powerful tool, isn't it? I mean, language is power, and if I might be so bold, I think unfortunately, language and terminology within the within the industry of voice teaching has for too long been used as a power tool to create exclusivity, I guess. One word that I think may or may not come up again and again in today's talk is the word belt. So that could be a way for us to jump into the sort of the overarching discussion point that I want to get into today with you, and that is around the topic of volume in singing, and belt is one of those terms that is used a lot, but does not always mean the same thing to the same people. Can we use that as a bit of a launching pad into
Hand off. Unpack that, Brian.
Yeah. There you go.
Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.
It needs to be unpacked, and you're right. That I think that is one of the main words that is used sort of like almost like a sledgehammer on people in the industry. That's not a belt. And then you're leaving a person with a, what's wrong with me? What haven't I figured out?
Yeah.
And really, belt is a qualitative analysis of what somebody's hearing. It's a quality of sound that is different from each individual. Like, what is the sound? And someone may not have the belt that you want for a particular role you're casting. That's fine. But to tell them they're not belting, so we need to, I guess, digest it. So I would say, for me, a belt, in what I've measured, again, having a voice lab is very helpful. I have my ears and I depend on them all the time, but being able to measure it and say, what's the contact time for the vocal folds? What's the flow? What is the acoustic output, right? And so things that have been called belt by a large group of people in analysis of particular singers, then you measure that. And really what it is a combination. It's a mix of elements from different registers.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? So you've got modal voice, which has a higher contact time. And then you've got light mechanism or head voice that has a higher flow and a thinner vocal fold margin, right? So if you combine that higher flow with a greater contact time, you're mixing those elements of register. And that's typically the configuration that will not spike your contact time, but it will give you a much louder sound. So thinning out the vocal folds a bit, but letting them stay together a little bit longer each time they vibrate, then and making sure that they're not staying together too long by making sure you either feel or you can actually measure a higher flow is present.
Yeah.
And you end up with the recipe for a very good belt that's sustainable because it doesn't wear out the vocal fold tissue.
Yeah. I like... Yeah. I think you did very well. Far be it from me to be judging whether your definition is good or not, but that makes complete sense to me because it's in keeping with certainly how how I instruct my students around. I mean, I boiled the term belt down to healthy, sustainable volume. And that's going to be, Dr. Dan, we are losing Dr. Gill. So it may well be that we just need to be a little bit more on the volume for you. That's all. Yeah, that I think that's just our usual Zoom issues, everyone. So we'll persevere, and I know Brian will turn his mic up at his end, and that'll be fine. Yeah, so it's this healthy, sustainable volume, I guess, which is quite challenging to really some interrupting again. This is everyone. It's I don't. I've been doing this live show for, I don't know, 300. I've done hundreds of live shows at Brian, as I've talked with you, and I have no idea why this is playing up. It shouldn't be doing it, but anyway, we're going to persevere, everyone, and hopefully those audio issues will be solved as we continue. Brian, yeah, so we're talking about, I often talk about the difference between effort and energy, and I'll generally break that down with a student. Can we talk about that difference between, that sense of, I think when singers do come to creating volume, they want to sort of lean into it and push into it, but in fact, more often than not, that's not what's required. Can you talk us through that balance?
Yeah, the process of it. I think is the volume okay now?
The difficulty we have, Brian, is at my end I can hear you perfectly clearly. So yeah, I'm hoping everything will be okay and that it'll just sort it out.
Okay. I can try and I can do an NPR cast. That's the National Public Radio.
Okay.
But yeah, so the main thing I'd say, you have this driving force.
Yeah.
Is the thoracic pressure that drives airflow to move the vocal folds so they start to vibrate. And when they vibrate, they're modulating that flow, and it causes increases of pressure and decreases of pressure, which are sound waves. And then that energy moves through a space above the vocal tract and gets enhanced. And so using a combination of that driving force with a smartly designed vocal fold vibration, which requires a bit more awareness on sensation, like how much resistance is there.
Yeah.
The work that you're talking about is often relatable to excess resistance at the level of the vocal folds. A person starts to speak or sing, and they feel the energy is like grabbed or stuck.
Yeah.
At the level of the vocal folds. That's when you know that there's too much resistance there, and you will then end up with extra effort and less sound.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating beyond belief.
Yes.
The next place we need to look at is then how is the vocal tract receiving the sound that's from here?
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of energy that's created here, and then it is filtered through this vocal tract. And if it is filtered wisely, the right energy gets enhanced to sound like a belt or to sound like classical music. It gets shaped in a certain way that then the audience will perceive it a certain way. It does not require a lot of effort physically. It requires more effort mentally and sensationally, more proprioceptive energy.
Yes. Yeah. I wonder if you just sort of talk more about that that proprioception and that energy of that physical sensation about, because that can be quite a challenge for some singers to really lock into, can't it?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it has to be awakened in most of us. The lucky few have a wonderful proprioception just to begin with. Maybe they had great vocal models when they were children.
Yeah.
And again, I'm always in awe of that. I was like, wow, you've never had to think about this. I have a couple of colleagues like that here at IU. They're like,
Yeah.
I've never had jaw tension or tongue tension. And I was like, wow. So good. That's awesome. But for those of us who don't have that lucky proprioception, we have to look towards some models. One of the models I think that's important to look towards is, what do people do who are licensed to rehabilitate, right? And in the States, at least, speech-language pathologists are looking for a sound that is easy to produce and vibrant in the facial tissue, which would mean is felt or sensed more towards the front of the face. That is something that they look for. They call one of the therapies resonant voice therapy.
Yep.
There's also flow phonation is another therapy.
Yep.
So we're looking for something that's produced that has ample flow and something that feels like the sound, instead of being at the back of the throat, it's felt more towards the front of the face.
Yeah.
I gave a big ballpark example of kind of gross stuck in the throat and then in the face, but that's what we're looking for. So we have to find tools that elicit these let's say beg or awaken proprioceptive awareness of sound energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see everyone's been apparently the audio is playing up and then being fixed, and everyone. I'm not touching anything. Well, we're just continuing. So I can only think that it's an internet issue. As far as Dr. Brian's audio cutting in and out, we are going to persevere, everyone. That is the best we can do. I think in one sense we can kind of just put this down to 2020. It's just how it's going to finish, I'm afraid. Today, of course, I didn't say this again. This is actually our last show for 2020. Oh dear. It can only get better next year, can't it? Yes. That's how we will ride with it. Yeah, so this sense of the interplay of resonance and frequency in playing a really important role in our development of volume is a big thing, isn't it? I wonder if you can explain to us because what I love about your teaching is that it's so accessible for us that just in simple terms, why does frequency, why does resonance particularly play such a why is that the thing that we need to go after for volume?
Yeah, there's certain hot spots in our hearing. That particularly around 2,500 to 3,000 hertz. So that's an interesting one because that falls in line with a frequency boost within operatic singing.
Yeah.
That's very necessary in a lot of cases for large orchestras to be able to be heard over large orchestras. We have to produce a frequency or frequencies that are in the range of 2,500 to 3,000 hertz to be heard over an orchestra.
Yeah.
And the ear is particularly sensitive to those frequencies. So the audience has the receiver that's really going to enjoy those frequencies, and it's going to enable us to be heard over an orchestra. Somewhat similar, like with belt, you're really dealing with a sound that is linked with kind of emergency. Like basically the frequency of a yell. If you were like, "Hey!" Ah! Sorry if that was really loud on the mic, but now I'm distorting everything. But it's linked with that type of vocalization that is based oftentimes second harmonic dominant. So the fundamental that we all hear is the pitch the person's singing. The next harmonic that's present above that, it really gets enhanced by the vocal tract, and it piques the interest of the ear of like, ooh, wow, something intense is happening. So frequency alerts the listener to some exciting material that's occurring in the drama, and so if we look towards exciting certain frequencies, we'll pique the interest of our listeners, and they'll perceive that as intense volume or intensity of performance. But it might not. In some case, it is augmentation of the frequency that gets us a louder sound. But sometimes it's just the frequencies of themselves that we hear as a bigger sound.
I find one of the challenging things that most students will have to, in a sense, struggle with, wrestle with, reconcile is that we are all given a set morphology. Our DNA gives us a set. I'm 5'8", for example, and I can't be 6'2". I'm just always going to be 5'8". And yet with voice, there is I guess a spectrum of which we can workshop and mold, manipulate that morphology, that our vocal tracts that we have as a part of our DNA, and yet there's always going to be a limit to that, isn't there, as to what our instrument is uniquely capable of. What do you do with students when they're looking to establish volume, but their instrument is they're working with their specific instrument?
Yes, I mean, there's several things I think about. I mean, first of all, if someone's working with a microphone, they don't need to worry about this at all. I mean, it's something that's boostable with a microphone, and
Yeah.
it instantly takes the pressure away. If you're doing a cabaret that's not mic'd, then you really have to think about it. If you're doing opera and it's usually not mic'd, you have to think about this. But if someone is working for volume, you're really looking for limits of the individual. And I think limits are shown to us by outside view of instability.
Yeah.
And you really want the main consideration, I think, in training voice and an individual's voice production is, can their tissue handle the amount of connection they have, which would mean a longer contact time.
Yeah.
So people who have a thicker mucosa on the vocal folds, they can withstand a longer contact time, which is actually going to enhance the sound more.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a bigger voice.
Yes.
Now, when they're doing that, they don't feel like they're working hard. It just happens. And they also don't have a jaw that's shaking, or tongue that's shaking, or a head that's shaking, or a body that's shaking. So if you're maybe not a naturally big voice singer with a thicker mucosa, if you're trying to make that sound, you'll start to notice your body shakes, or you feel much more effort. And so it's not an option. It's not an option because it's not sustainable. If the instrument is taxed and instability arises from this attempt, it's not the right balance for that person. So essentially, what I'm looking for is a match of there. I guess let me reduce it to this. There are two main ways you can get louder. One would be by increasing resistance here, and up to a point, and then, like I said earlier, you'll lose volume. But you can do it like that. So it's an increase of subglottal pressure and resistance at the same time. And then the other way is configuring the vocal folds in a way that when they shut off, they have a really quick shut off pattern that excites higher harmonics, which actually makes the sound fuller and richer and have more volume to it. And the way you can ensure that, again, goes back to what's called flow phonation.
Yeah.
And if the person feels like there's a heightened flow, then they're in the right ballpark. If they feel like it's been cut off too much, then they're in the ballpark where they're going to injure their voice, possibly.
When I am introducing the concept of belt volume to a singer, I find myself always saying to them, okay, we've talked about belt today, we've talked about volume today. But actually, for the next number of weeks, I don't want you to aim for volume. I want you to aim for balance. Mm-hmm. Let's achieve balance first, and the volume will then come. And that's what I kind of hear you kind of getting at, is that we've got to get that, for that individual, we've got to get the balance first. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, the balance, yes, their equilibrium. You know,
Yeah.
what is their sweet spot?
Sweet spot,
And
optimal
then
setting,
yeah, and
Goldilocks zone.
exact Goldilocks zone. I love it. Yes, and once we find that, there are little tiny changes a person can make to enhance it even more.
Yeah.
And I have yet to meet a singer that doesn't have enough volume. When
Yeah.
finely tuned, I have yet to meet a singer who doesn't have enough volume.
And important point that you made, just a few moments ago, and that is certainly in my case where I only teach contemporary voice, we're always on a mic.
Yep.
So volume really then becomes an issue of being able to create contrast of levels so that you can be perceived to be, singing quieter at times, so that you get that colouring contrast to being louder. What do you find are some of the really key attributes of working? Because a lot of people who are watching our show right now, who are continuing to be very patient, what do you find are some really key attributes to a sort of developing volume while on a mic?
Yeah, well, it's funny, as we talk about mics, I think back to conversations I've had with some of my favorite voice teachers in New York, while I was there. And again, I still, before COVID, was going back once a month to train my private studio. Lots of, Broadway folks and pop and everything as well. And one of the conversations that rings in my brain with some of my most respected colleagues, we were all talking about some of the top people on Broadway, and it kept coming up. You're like, man, if you take that voice off a mic, it is one of the smallest sounds ever.
Yeah.
So it's like that's a key thing I think to keep in mind. Like some of the most celebrated belters, if they're not mic'd on stage, then it is not this like sound you would expect.
Yes.
It's plenty, but it's not a sound you would expect. Like they're really like yelling or anything. It's nothing of the sort. And the other one is from the sound people. They would much rather that kind of sound because then they can manipulate it more.
Yes.
So doing something that's blowing out the mic, it ruins the day of the sound engineers, both in a studio or on stage. So I always have that conversation with my students. It's like, think about that. Think about what we're doing. Think about tissue cost. And so around volume, I think you're right. The getting an established balance first, and then kind of exploring what is the full range in terms of dynamic for that individual.
Yeah.
And a big part of it is what you said, and I agree 1,000% if one can, that it's about contrast.
Yeah.
Musicality is about contrast.
Yes.
I get a little quieter and then I get a little louder, whatever it is. That is what communication is.
Yes.
We're looking for differences. And so finding what contrast, and within different genres, it's different. Opera, as one of my colleagues here always says, dynamics begin at the back of the hall. That's incredibly true for opera. You can't be thinking about quiet as something that's really quiet. It's not going to make it. So it's about quality more than quantity in opera. In music theater and pop and anything that's mic'd, it has a lot to do with wide variance, in how much sound is actually coming out, and then a great sound engineer that makes it sound phenomenal in the house.
Yeah, and in fact, what I often say to students is, don't determine what your volume needs to be according to where you think it needs to end up. Determine where that volume needs to from the very beginning, and if you can start. You can create the same level of contrast. Don't start at a 7 and expect yourself to go to an 11.
Yep.
If you start at a 2 and go to a 7, you've got a bigger range of contrast. The audience is going to hear volume dynamic shift and change, and but you're still only at a 7. You're actually ending up where you would have started.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tissue cost, the savings is so worth it. because then
Absolutely.
you can do the interview before or after the show, or on the morning show if you're on a tour. That's the key. You've got to think about all the other voice use you're going to have that's included in the roles that you get or the tour that you do. So yeah, I think that's beautifully said. You're looking for that. What is the range of this person's voice?
Yeah.
And then if this is the range of the dynamics, then start here and then climax here
Here.
instead of up here
Y-
and then trying to push it
y-
past your
y-
max.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the great benefit of contemporary vocal, as we've already talked about, is we're on a mic. And I think, unfortunately, historically, due to a great deal of a lack of understanding, and I'd love you to talk to this if you could, we've kind of, there's been this view that microphones only, are there for volume. And for so long, they were seen as purely as a crutch for singers who can't create volume. And yet, actually, microphones are being used like that. Yes, they do create volume, but of course they do so much more, especially in the world now of, you know, uh, looping and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
What do you, when you're working with a student on a mic and you're working with volume, what are you typically instructing them to do?
Let the mic work for you.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, and that awareness. We're dealing with, what are you competing with? In opera, you're competing with acoustic instruments for the most part, until you get to something like, like last year. I think it was last year, or maybe the year before. We did Steve Jobs, the revolution, or the evolution of Steve Jobs, and that has a lot of electronic instrumentation. So
Mm-hmm.
there needed to be mics. So, and in Broadway pits too, there are amplified, which means using electricity to boost the sound instruments. They're amplified, and to compete with that with voice, it's just unrealistic.
Yeah.
Acoustic instruments are one thing, but I think it's a completely different ballpark. So it's a necessity, and it's a completely different aesthetic, and I think that's an important thing to point out here. But initially, you want to work with dynamics. You want to work with position of the mic and proximity of mic, because the proximity of the mic changes a lot, like the
Yes.
volume. So if I talk like this and then I continue to talk the same, it gets a lot louder as I approach the mic.
Yeah.
And so the person has to be aware of that sweet spot too. Where is the average distance I'm going to be from the verse? And then if I want to climax in the chorus of a song, I might actually back off a little bit to keep it in the same realm, because the notes in the chorus are already higher, and I don't want it to be disproportionately loud. So you really have to discuss balance throughout an entire song when you've got the mic boosting you.
Yeah. We have a very famous male pop rock singer here in Australia called John Farnham. I don't know if you've ever heard of John.
Distant bell. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay. So John is, anyway, I remember working with a sound engineer, a guy that does a lot of sound here in Brisbane, who had done a lot of sound with John.
Hmm.
And he and I actually asked him, this is back in my cocky, 2020s, because I was probably searching for a compliment and actually got served a lesson. Where I said, so who's the best singer you've ever worked with? And he was straight. He said, straight up, the best singer to mix I've ever mixed is John Farnham. And I said, oh, why is that? And he said, because I set the fader, so that's the volume slider. And he said, and he does the rest. He literally does everything else on mic.
Yeah.
He's just that good at managing his volume, his levels, his color, his tone, and he said, as a result, for me doing the sound, it's an easy gig because I can just set it and forget it,
Forget it. Yeah.
and it's something I've never forgotten, because I go, wow, I don't think I've ever achieved it, to be honest. That level of finicky skill is quite impressive. So volume is one thing, but of course volume, we titled today, and we probably have to head towards wrapping up. But volume, I titled today's video Sing with More Zing. And the word zing doesn't necessarily need to mean volume.
Yep.
Correct. What else could you interpret that to be?
To me, zing is presence of high frequency energy in the sound. So some people call it twang. There are lots of different things that you'll hear it called, but it's high frequency energy in the sound. And that was one thing I've done a research project on with Johan Sundberg and Jessica Lee and Philippe Alain. We were measuring levels of velopharyngeal opening, which is quite nerdy. It's just access into the nasopharynx.
Yeah.
Which most people speak with a little bit of velopharyngeal opening. So there's a quick access to the nasal continuance and things.
Yep.
And it doesn't completely close off like I'm doing now. It sounds like I have a cold when it's completely closed off. If it were wildly open, then it would start to sound like that, and you would end up with a lot of nasality in the sound.
Yeah.
So we wanted to see what are the acoustic results of finding a sweet spot where there's just a little bit of opening, not a lot, and not none. So we looked, and the difference was if you had no opening there, you would end up with a lot of low-end information and weaker high-end information. Yeah. So it'd be a sound like that. And if it were wide open, you would end up with a lot of high and a little bit of low. And then if it were that sweet spot, you end up with a lot of low and a lot of high. And so it ends up having the zing in the sound that piques the ear and the interest.
Yeah.
And again, does kind of come across as volume.
Yeah.
Because in acoustic sense, it has a much fuller boost throughout the spectrum, not just one area. And so I think that zing is an important element in perception of sound quality.
There's two things I want to quickly unpack with you there. Firstly, what you just said, perception. And it's, I often say to singers, beauty is in the ear of the beholder. We have to recognize that our sound is being perceived by other people differently. I want to talk about that if we can. And the second thing, I forget what that was going to be. So let's talk about the perception.
You sound like me. Two very important things. The first is, what's the second one?
I don't know. Let's talk about perception.
Yeah, the perception. I think that what makes the voice world wonderful, but also crazy, is the fact that we're dependent on a receiver for our sound.
Yeah.
Right. And the number of students that I have that are successful, but that started off by hitting a brick wall because they were told by some influential people, that's not it, you're not doing the right thing. I mean, it's through the roof. The number of people, they'll hit a wall, and then they continue to do the same thing, because I am saying, it's right, I promise, it's right, and then they get picked up by somebody else, whether it's a record company, or whether it's a Broadway show, or whatever, or tour, or band, whatever. They get picked up, doing the same thing that they had been doing where the door was slammed, and then all of a sudden the industry flips it around, and next thing you know, they're accepted by even people who said no initially, doing the exact same thing. So we're very dependent on the receiver of sound, and so unfortunately we have to say you cannot map out your career based on an individual's opinion of your voice. You have to develop a voice team that helps you understand what your balance is. You have to develop some self-possession where you learn how to say what you want to say, and then you need to shop that around tirelessly. You really have to be indefatigable. You go out and you shop that around everywhere you can, and you're going to find people who bite. You're going to find people who want it.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? And in fact, I remember you actually making a point of this in a masterclass while you were here in Australia doing the ANATS conference. Yeah. And I was so excited to hear you say it, because it's something that I have said to my own students. And that is, it's interesting how within contemporary music, we spend all of our careers saying, I want to have an individual sound. I want to sound unique. And yet, what we end up doing, for the most part, is sounding like everyone else. We end up just creating a not dissimilar aesthetic, dependent on what genre you're in, because actually to create a unique sound is you've got to really, it's a risk.
Brave. You have to be brave.
You've got to be so brave and vulnerable to criticism, because not everyone's going to like it.
That's right. And until other key people like it, and then all of a sudden it spreads back out, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. It's a weird, mystical, magical, kind of depressing thing because it morphs. You can't predict it, and you're like, oh, now so and so wants it, or this theater, that person loved it. This other theater that said no, they're best friends, and they said no, you should really check her out again.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's just the way it works.
And I mean, I remember I've got a student, a past student, and she had been browbeaten by a previous teacher who had just told her, like constantly for years on end, that she had way too much vibrato in her voice as a contemporary singer. Like, just to the point, because it was a higher rate vibrato. And I used to say to her, but actually, that's what I hear in your voice that I like. The challenge for her is that had become a barb that had really dug in and into her psyche. Yes. And she really found it quite challenging to get beyond that, to recognize that now, if we look around, there are so many contemporary singers who have this rather high rate vibrato, and it is a part of their vocal signature that causes us to go, oh, that's such and such.
I know who they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's a unique stand-up.
Because it's unique.
Yep.
And I think now in contemporary voice, we are at a point where we're no longer saying, right, wrong, or indifferent. We're now going, is it healthy? Is it sustainable?
Yep.
And is there going to be some people that are going to lock onto it and love it?
That's right. And a big part, the base of that is an honest conversation with each individual of how effortful it is, like you mentioned earlier. I think that's a key thing. If it feels, and the person has to be honest,
Yeah.
If it feels effortful, it's not going to be sustainable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
go ahead. No, I was going to say not night in, night out.
Yeah. There's no way to sustain that. No. If you're touring, you're exhausted touring.
Yes.
For those of us who have done it, it is unbelievable. Like when you're going and you're not in your bed and in a different place and trying to figure it out, or sleep deprived if you've gone to Europe from the Americas or whatever, or Australia. So we have to consider that. It's got to be easy. And then the other thing is you have to keep in mind the perception part of it. I think currently we're in an era where a high-end energy signals nasality to a ginormous portion of the voice world. And we have to get out of it, because one thing that has been measured with this velopharyngeal opening that I talked about is there is a lot of energy in the low end, while there's a lot of energy in the high end. That's the key difference between nasality and not nasality. And so looking for that EQ difference is key. But unfortunately, a lot of people have chimed into just the presence of that high end energy, and then they try and shut it down, and then the person is going to be at major risk, I think.
And believe it or not, that was actually my second point that I'd forgotten earlier. I wanted to talk about this negative notion that has been built around nasality, and I find myself, as I'm sure you do, having to undo this perception that nasal is bad.
Yeah. Well, and it depends on the receiver of the sound.
Yeah.
And so my point is, we can now find acoustic balance looking at a spectrum.
Yeah.
Like, it is the fundamental and other lower partials critically dampened by the position of the vocal tract, then you could look at it and say, okay, sure, that is nasal.
Yeah.
Although again, it's just a sound, so you might like it or not like it.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be ruled out. But we can look at the acoustic and see what's going on now. And I think that's an important thing that everyone should look into and develop a bit more of an accepting perception.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that's an okay way to say it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, people get
Absolutely.
so attached. I think one of the things that's helped me be an effective voice teacher is it's to no credit on my end. I mean, I ended up with great mentors, and that helped. That's the main reason. The other thing is, and I don't know why, I have a really wide palette of acceptable sounds in my mind.
Yeah.
I've never heard a singer that I went, ooh, ever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit shocking to most people, but I'm always listening to potential of balance and potential of sound, and I hear individuals, and I'm like, ooh, interesting. Interesting. What does that voice need, or maybe that's balance for them. Wow, what a unique timbre. So
yeah, absolutely. And you are a fantastic teacher, and which is why I wanted to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
And again.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. That means a lot coming from you, because you are as well. I really appreciate it.
You're very kind. We do need to wrap it up. What a crazy year. What a crazy couple of shows we've had. I do want to say thank you to you, Brian, for being so patient in helping me to get today's show up and running. I want to say thank you to everyone that's kept watching, because
I just feel horrible, though, because out of the hundreds of shows, I'm part of the two that didn't go so well.
And I'm still sitting here racking my brain, Brian, as to why that could possibly be. I have no idea. But look, I do appreciate having you on, and I'm very much hoping that we can do it again in the future, and not be dealing with the tech issues that we have, because, as our conversation, finally got underway, I've just so thoroughly enjoyed, your insights. And I know that, if people have the opportunity to watch back over the show today, at least the parts where the audio was clean, they're going to get a lot out of what you had to say. I can't go to our usual end screen, because if we do, we'll probably lose the audio. But everyone, thank you for joining me over the last year of live shows. Today is our final show for 2020. Woohoo! And we're now taking, here in Australia, we are of course heading into our summer period. So I'm about to go into summer break, and so I will be back, all things being equal, and I'll have the tech issues figured out, the first Monday of February 2021. So make sure, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe and hit the white bell icon so you don't miss any notifications for when we go live again. A big thank you to Linda, our moderator. She jumps in every week faithfully and puts the questions up, and Linda contributes so much to our community here at Voice Essentials. So thank you, Linda. You, in my books, are an absolute legend, and so thank you very much. But of course, we are a community, and I want to say thank you to all of you who have been tuning in faithfully all year. I hope that these shows are bringing you so much more value add to your learning experience, no matter whether you're engaged with a singing teacher in your local area, or you're doing my online course. Whatever you're doing, I hope that our live shows are helping you. And I know they will continue to do so again in 2021, when I'm hoping we'll get Brian back. And we'll have him back, because volume is not Brian's only string to his bow. We could be here all year just with Brian unpacking his depth of knowledge. But we're going to say goodbye. I'm going to wave you all a very Merry Christmas for those of you who celebrate Christmas. But if you don't, I hope you have a safe and prosperous new year. And I look forward to seeing you in the new year when we come back. When you, as you all know, you'll always hear me end each show by saying, I'm Dr. Dan. Sing well.